Welcome to everyone joining us.
Yeah.
For the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators C.Arb.'s annual Alexander Lecture, which will shortly be delivered by Francis Xavier. My name's Catherine Dixon, and I'm C.Arb.'s Director General, and I take this opportunity to warmly welcome Francis and C.Arb.'s President Jane Gunn. It's wonderful to be able to host this lecture face-to-face while also allowing C.Arb. Members from around the world to join us virtually, and particularly during Congress. For those of you who have joined us for Congress today, I do hope you've enjoyed the event. The title of the Alexander Lecture this year is Resolving Intractable Interstate Disputes, a Sisyphean Struggle. Francis, I'm sorry, but I did have to Google the meaning of Sisyphean. So Google tells me that Sisyphean denotes or relates to a task that can never be completed, something requiring continual and often ineffective effort. It struck me that this definition should be included in the job description for a Director General. However, what we'll hear from Francis will be much more relevant and enable us to better understand the workings of interstate dispute resolution and how this must change if we are to create a safer world. I know that Francis has a keen interest in the rule of law and how effective dispute resolution can support the rule of law and enable access to justice. Francis will talk through the mechanisms by which interstate disputes are currently resolved. He will examine the efficacy as well as the serious gaps currently present before looking ahead at what must change. As we see rising levels of global conflict, the impact of climate change, high levels of inflation, and increasingly polarized political views, having effective mechanisms for resolving interstate disputes is becoming ever more relevant. I know that this topic will prompt many questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing Francis's lecture and the questions and answer session afterwards. Just before I introduce our speaker for the evening, a few housekeeping issues. Firstly, a massive thank you to our sponsor for the evening, JAMS. Your ongoing support of our events is really appreciated. Thank you. Jane Gunn, C.Arb.'s President, who is an experienced and published mediator and recognised international speaker, having spoken at the United Nations, the White House, the European Commission and the International Energy Agency, to name a few, will be asking Francis questions at the end of the lecture and giving the closing remarks. If you are online and have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, not the chat. Please use the chat function to chat, maybe tell us who you are and why you are part of C.Arb. It's wonderful to see how diverse our audiences are at these events, and it's always great to hear from our members. Jane will try to get through as many questions as possible, but please don't be disappointed if we don't have time for your question. For everyone in the room, in case of a fire alarm, there's no practice session, so please do follow the instructions and evacuate the buildings. The fire doors, there's one there and there's one there. It now gives me immense pleasure to introduce Francis Xavier. To many of us, Francis needs little introduction. Francis practices cross-border commercial litigation and international and treaty arbitration. Despite his youthful looks, he is a veteran in the field. Francis has 33 years of legal practice, has a track record of being involved in novel and unprecedented cases, and is recognised as a leading disputes lawyer globally. He was recently named as Asia's top 15 litigators by Asian Legal Business. He's a chartered arbitrator and a past chair of C.Arb Singapore branch, and he was C.Arb.'s president during 2020, during the COVID, which makes it very special that he can be here with us this evening. Welcome, Francis, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us this evening.
Well, you know, I'm truly impressed with the number of you who are still here after having clocked so many hours in what has been a demanding day at work for you at CIArb. It doesn't take, even a blind man can see that we live in a highly fractured world, which is increasingly fracturing further. Europe is currently the epicenter of one of the fissures that have opened up. The Ukraine war, the scale of the war, is a degree of armed conflict that has not been seen on this continent since the Second World War. Europe remains dependent on Russia for its energy, dependent on China for its trade, but it does remain a US protectorate, if I could say that, dependent on the US for its security. Now, what I think is scary to most of us is that the conversation around what is happening in the world, there's another fissure opening up, which has already opened up in Taiwan. The conversation is turning nuclear. We are entering the age of nuclear brinkmanship, right? So the conversation is revolving around, are Chinese nuclear submarines in the Pacific, are they detectable? What is the degree of Russian military superiority over the West? In US military language, we started the year at code green, DEFCON 4, moderate level of alert. With the start of the Ukraine war, we moved into DEFCON 3, code yellow, high caution, high level of alert. And we seem to be slowly moving towards the next level, which is level red. NATO has, for the first time, listed China as a security threat. Now, obviously, many things have brought us here to this place where, many things are broken. And I will touch on some of them that relates to the work of the Chartered Institute in particular as dispute resolvers. Let me start with disputes revolving around international trade. And the main actor there is the World Trade Organization. As you know, it has 164 members, with 25 in the process of being inducted. But these 164 members account for 98% of world trade. The dispute resolution aspect of the WTO was for many, many years, since the WTO was formed in 1995, after 9 years of backbreaking work in the Uruguay round between 1986 and 1994, the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO has been hailed as truly revolutionary and vaunted as one of the features of international law that is unbelievably effective. As you know, there is a process in the WTO. There's a dispute. The central thing about the WTO disputes and resolution mechanism is that there is compulsory jurisdiction over trade disputes, insofar as the WTO members are concerned, which is remarkable in a world stage. So the dispute resolution mechanism, the WTO mechanism, oversees 60 global agreements, 300 regional trade agreements, and the work of the dispute settlement processes, the panel, and the appellate body of the WTO has been prolific. Now, as you know, the panels are ad hoc, the first level panels are ad hoc, and then you can appeal to the appellate body. There are 7 permanent members who are appointed and renewed from time to time with a 4-year term. Now, their work, as I've just mentioned, is prolific. From the inception of the World Trade Center, World Trade Organization, 614 disputes have come into the architecture. 189 went into appeals. And the work of the appellate body is remarkable. They usually deliver a verdict in a matter of months. You're talking about 3-4 months. The disputes are complex. The content is complex. The rule book of the WTO rule book is in excess of 30,000 pages. But still, they manage the time, you know. And the infrastructure has been so successful that, you know, what happens? You go through the process. If there is non-compliance, the affected state is entitled to impose retaliatory trade measures on the offending state. And this has only occurred in less than 1% of the cases. But you know, success brings its own problems. And one of the things, if I could touch on, one of the major players in today's geopolitical landscape, as you will remember, China, the People's Republic of China, replaced Taiwan. So at the beginning of 1971, Taiwan was not only a member of the UN, it also had a seat on the Security Council. In 1971, Taiwan was ejected, and the People's Republic of China took its place, both as a member of the UN and with having a seat at the UN Security Council. Now, on the topic of international trade, China became part of the WTO infrastructure in 2001. And so, because of the robust rules framework, dispute resolution framework of the WTO, and the inclusion of one of the largest market segments in the world, China, we saw explosive growth in trade between 2000, where global trade volume of global trade stood at about 6 trillion, to today, where it's gone up 4 times to about 23, 24 trillion volume of global trade. Now, obviously, this level of trade, a big part of it between US and China, you know, there would be room for disagreement on many things. And historically, the US and China have looked at the WTO framework differently, right? So China does subsidize domestic players through its subsidies to its state-owned enterprises. America says that violates WTO rules because you then make your domestic players more competitive internationally when they are exporting stuff and importing stuff. The US is importing stuff. Now, this, of course, was ventilated over the course of the last 2 decades, ever since China joined the WTO. America has taken 23 cases in the WTO against China. China has taken 15 against the US. And there were a series of decisions where, you know, from an American perspective, the panels, the dispute panels of the WTO were unfairly taking the position advocated by the People's Republic of China. Now, let's just step back into what happened, right? So, the success we were talking about. So, this explosive economic growth has shifted the landscape. We all know that political and military dominance does, to a large extent, if not exclusively, flow from economic dominance. So if you were to look at 2000, the year 2000, when Pax Americana was at its highest ebb. A pretty high ebb, let's put it that way. Global trade, in terms of share of global trade, measured in GDP on PPP terms, US held 20%. EU, 20%. China stood at about 7%. Today, the US is at 15%. The EU, similarly, at about 15%. China, at about 19%. Now, the US obviously was a very dominant force in World War II when it entered the war because of its economic might. It could build countless planes, and it built 122 aircraft carriers during the course of World War II. And it could do that because it had the money to build those aircraft carriers. Now, so this shift in global power obviously resulted in events occurring, and one of them took place in March 2018. So in March 2018, you will recall, on 8th and 22nd March, I think, the US, well, I would say it was a trade war, right? It was the announcement of a trade war, which the World Trade Organization's framework forbid, right? You don't unilaterally impose tariffs on another member state. What you have to do is, if you have a problem, you take it up to a panel. Of course, you start the process of discussions first. Take it up to a panel, you're not happy, you appeal it. And then at the end of it, if nothing happens, the offending state doesn't do what it needs or it's ordered to do, then you take retaliatory measures, right? So in March 2018, under the leadership of Trump, a slew of tariffs were announced. The US was, largest steel importer, significant tariffs, 25% on steel imports, 10% on aluminium, and then there was an entire array of tariffs on $60 billion worth of imports, all of which were targeted principally at China, and restrictions on technology transfer. Now, naturally, China went to the WTO, 4th April 2018, and not surprisingly, the WTO ruled that this was in violation of WTO rules. And you know what happened next. The US then took steps to neutralize the WTO processes, right? So you remember the dispute, the appellate body of the WTO, 7 members. Now the WTO is unique in that all of its processes are by consensus, not majority. Everyone has to agree. So every time an appointment ended, one of the 7 judges, their 4-year terms ended, either they needed to be renewed or a fresh appointment needed to be made, the US rejected those decisions. So by November 2019, the number of 7, to the best of my recollection, well, it went down below 3, 1 if I'm not mistaken. And at that time, in November 2019, there were 24 appeals pending, right? By November, 2 years ago, November 2020, the last judge retired. Yeah, the term expired, right? So for the last 2 years, the WTO system, the crown jewel is now missing. We can't find it anywhere. So it's broken. The appellate system exists only in the treaty. It is non-functional, right? Now, I don't want to bore you with, interim measures that have been put place in a number of countries, 54, the MPIA initiative. Some of you will be aware. I will not go into it. unless you ask me a question about it, but if you're that curious. So, in the international trade front, we have nothing to stop, countless trade wars. We have many, you can see many are being played out in front of our eyes, but there's nothing to prevent this escalation of trade tensions. Now, before I go to the next aspect, which is the next threat, which is the threat to international peace and security, I just want to say that on this trade front, there is some glimmer of light in the tunnel. In June this year, the 15th Ministerial Conference of the WTO was held. Now, the Ministerial Conference has not convened since 2017. And two things occurred, right, which gives us some hope. One is, you will recall in the Doha rounds, the rule book, the WTO rule book goes back some years. There is a need, as in, every rule book or legislation, to update them, right? New developments, technological changes, different concerns, sustainability, etc. So the Doha round tried to update these rules. That ended in 2015 in failure, on key issues like agriculture, fishing. No headway was made. But in June 22 this year, some headway was made with agriculture, fishing, and food security. So that was a breakthrough. More importantly, every member of the WTO committed itself, including the US, to fixing the problem with the dispute settlement mechanism, and a target has been set for 2024. Now, whether it will be met, your guess is as good as mine, but there is at least a commitment to work together to resolve it. Now, let's move to international peace and security. The question is there a robust equivalent of the WTO dispute resolution mechanism in this arena? Now, I suspect all of you know the answer, but this is a lecture and I can't say I'll move on to the next point. So, right at the center is the United Nations, right? And so you have the first organ. Let's talk about three relevant organs. The first organ, the UN General Assembly. Now, the UN General Assembly is a unique creature because it truly represents the entire world. 193 member states, 2 remaining member states, Palestine and Vatican observer status, and of course a number of other territories like Kosovo, which, not all states recognize them. So the UN General Assembly, which effectively represents the entire globe, is a toothless tiger made of paper, because all it can do on an offending state is to apply peer pressure effectively. Its recommendations are not binding, and they're merely that, recommendatory. Moving to the second organ, the apex organ of the United Nations, the Security Council. Again, you'll know exactly what's happening at the Security Council. Now, on paper, the Security Council has vast powers. Under Article 33(2), I believe, 33(1) obliges states to resolve disputes peacefully. 33(2) of the UN Charter empowers the UN Security Council to instruct members to do so, right? And member states have an obligation to comply with UN Security Council directives. Article 41 empowers the UN Security Council to issue non-use of force measures, sanctions, arms embargoes. For instance, in the Eritrea-Ethiopia conflict, the UN Security Council imposed an arms embargo on both parties, right? Third powerful weapon, Article 42, actually empowers the UN Security Council to sanction use of force by utilizing UN forces. As best as I can tell, that's only occurred once in human history, in the Korean War. Now, but as you know, the UN Security Council, for practical purposes, when there's a dispute involving the aligned interests of one of its 5 permanent members, takes on the form of the tiger that we just spoke about with the UN General Assembly. The work output of the Security Council is truly prolific. Even during the era of the pandemic, and I looked into this, from January 2020 to October 2022, during the height, big part of the height of the pandemic, the UN Security Council met 477 times. But with the veto power, all that work goes to naught. The last organ of the UN I want to speak about is the International Court of Justice. Unfortunately, the ICJ does not have a compulsory jurisdiction, as in the WTO system, right? So, if a dispute arises, the ICJ has no jurisdiction. It's only when a dispute arises among the member states and both parties to the conflict agree and consent to put it before the ICJ, only then is the ICJ seized of jurisdiction. Now, there is one exception to this. The ICJ, in the UN architecture, there is an avenue whereby states can subject themselves to the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ. So currently, as of today, there are 73 members who have done so, and that includes the UK, a number of European states, India, Pakistan, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. Now, but a number of states have pulled out. At one time, they gave compulsory jurisdiction to the ICJ, but they've withdrawn it. So France at one point was under this framework. Some of you may recall there was that dispute between France and New Zealand and Australia over the nuclear tests that France was then carrying out and intended to further carry out in the South Pacific. Because of that, France pulled out when a case in the ICJ was instituted by New Zealand and Australia in 1973, I believe. Yes. US similarly was subjected to the compulsory jurisdiction. And then there was the Nicaragua case before the ICJ. Nicaragua took the US to the ICJ. You would recall, some of you may recall, that the US was supporting the Contra rebels against the Sandinistas. And the ICJ found that the US was guilty of a violation of the use of force in having mined certain Nicaraguan harbors and in arming the Contra rebels. And so the US, after the 1986 ICJ decision, pulled out of compulsory jurisdiction. So the key players today, the result is that the key players, Russia, in today's conflict, let's say, Russia, China, the US, they are not subjected to any compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ. India and Pakistan are. So, if there's a future conflict between India and Pakistan, at least we know there's compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ. Now, so what you're looking at is a broken world order, right? let me give you an analogy. You know, you have a very complex commercial arrangement, and there is no recourse to dispute a proper dispute resolution. You know, you have a general obligation to resolve the dispute peacefully. You know, no definite parameters as to what you're supposed to do to comply with that obligation to general, you know, and Article 33(1) actually says, you know, if there's a dispute, you know, you can go to mediation, conciliation, a whole slew of different mechanisms of your choice. You decide what you want to do. You have an obligation to resolve it peacefully, and you decide how you're going to go about it. So it's really general, vague, undefined. And if you had a contract where, you know, you had no recourse, you know, to a mechanism which will resolve the dispute, one way or the other, that's unthinkable in a commercial setting. But now that's a reality in the international stage. Let me say a few words about Russia. Now, as you know, Putin came into power in 2000, 9 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Russians, as you know, consider themselves to be part of Europe. And not surprisingly, Vladimir Putin sought repeatedly to be included as a member, for the Russian Federation to be included as a member of NATO. Obviously, he was politely rebuffed many times. I mean, one wonders, right? If he had been admitted, maybe some of the problems we are facing today will not exist. We will not live in a world so divided as we have today. But, you know, obviously, that question is beyond my pay grade, and most of us here, I guess. So whether Russia should be inducted into NATO. Now, but Russia did join the WTO in August 2012. But, you know, the Russian economy never benefited, because you know what happened shortly after 2012. In 2014, the invasion of the Crimean Peninsula, and then there was a whole barrage of sanctions, right, which hit the Russians. So if you look at the share of global GDP of the Russians in 2012, when they joined the WTO, it was at 3.46%. And today, it's at 2.87%. So in all these years, the Russian economy has actually contracted. Because, you know, we may not appreciate it. These sanctions are the new form of weaponry, financial weaponry, sometimes more devastating than, you know, armed conflict. So, you know, we are informed by commentators who are in the know that U.S. foreign policy in the last 20 years, for instance, sanctions have become the primary resort, the tool of first resort, right? U.S. sanctions, we are told, between 2000 and 2021 has increased 1,000-fold. They now affect, there are 8,000 measures affecting 42 countries, which translates to about 1/3 of humanity. And of course, you know, the level of sanctions. Now, China is issuing counter-sanctions. So we are living in an age where, you know, the world is very broken, right? So I'm glad to tell you that I'm going to the last part of my lecture. Well, you know, I'm looking to you guys to tell us what to do. Now, and this is why I chose this topic when I was, you know, approached by Catherine to consider delivering something today. It took me a while, even after I decided on what I should speak about. I spent many weeks not knowing what I was going to say and how I was even going to start. But I want to start this part of the lecture by saying, look, CIArb is one of several global organizations in this field. Everyone around me here, and many of you, in cyberspace, taking part in cyberspace, you are experts. This is your forte, dispute resolution, right? Now, the kind of disputes that we are talking about today, we are discussing, doesn't intersect with, for most of us on a day-to-day basis, with the kind of work that we do, right, in the private sphere. And even the work that the Chartered Institute does, right, on a day-to-day basis. But the question I think we have to ask ourselves today is, given where we have arrived, as a global organization committed to effective dispute resolution through ADR, should we, as a global organization who have voices across the globe in all of these jurisdictions that we talk about, Russia, we have a healthy membership, China, in the US, and every other part, practically all parts of the world are accessible to us and we are active in them. Should we lend our weight, voice, and thought leadership to bear on these issues? And if we are minded to do so, coming back to Abdel's question, what can be done? So let's look at it, right? First, on the trade front. Now, at the heart of the trade front is the rules, right? The rules need to be updated. And as I said, some progress in June, but there's still a lot of disagreements. So there's a commitment, but the WTA rule book needs to be negotiated. And this is one of the problems that the US has brought to the fore, right? As far as the US is concerned, look, the rule book is many rules, times have changed, so the rules for the new world is ambiguous. Developments has outstripped some parts of the rules. The rules are incomplete in many respects. And what the US says has been happening is that the dispute panels have taken on a judicial role. When they see a lacuna in the name of rule interpretation, they have in fact been creating rules, which, according to the US, and understandably so, the framework of the WTO is that the rules are not made by the dispute panels. The rules are made by the member states through negotiation, right? So, judicial activism on the part of the dispute, the appellate body and the dispute panels is impermissible, right? Now, obviously, there's a heated debate over this. But the point is, there needs to be consensus on an updated rule book, right? And some peripheral issues also need to be dealt with, If there's a lacuna moving into the future, despite our best efforts at updating the rule book on issues such as subsidies to state-owned enterprises, can a WTO dispute panel, when faced with a lacuna, can it resolve that situation as it thinks it should, or should it then refer the matter back to the WTO membership at large? Issues such as that also need to be resolved moving forward, right? And I think global organizations, some of you may differ, some of you may agree, but, one thought is that a global organization such as the CIArb needs to get involved in this debate, to lend its weight, to lend its support to ensure that this exercise where, the WTO itself has set a deadline of 2024 is achieved. That's on the international trade front. Now, if that's achieved, then everything else will fall into place, right? We will then suddenly rediscover the missing crown jewels. One jewel. Now, I move to international peace and security. I think, it's quite clear that in our lifetimes, we're not going to see a compulsory mechanism at the ICJ or any other UN organ. But what else can we do? We could firstly strengthen preventive diplomacy through ADR, which is something that we are the experts in. The CIRB is the expert in. Now, that's not to downplay the current efforts. The UN does spend an inordinate amount of time through its organs and also through the good offices of the UN Secretary General at resolving disputes through mediation, conciliation, peace processes. And you will recall, Kofi Annan resolving very effectively the Cameroon-Nigeria border dispute, for instance. So this is happening, right? Now, in 2006, two jurists, Frazier and Dixon, published the results of a mammoth study that they carried out. They studied 1,178 militarized interstate disputes, so interstate disputes involving the use of some form of force. They found that in this 1,178 disputes, only 3%, 37 disputes, went to arbitration or adjudication, went through a process which would result in a decision, a binding decision. Out of the remaining 97%, some 280, about 22% went through a process of mediation or conciliation or some form of a peace process. So the vast number of militarized disputes on the face of our blue planet goes through neither, doesn't go through ADR at all. Now, that's an alarming thing, right? When we remind ourselves, if we don't want history to repeat itself, if we are going to learn from the past, we know that all it takes is a single spark to start a fire across the globe. So obviously, this is a space where, global organizations in the business of ADR need to get involved, right? We need more of these disputes to go through preventive diplomacy. When tensions start to arise, there's been some criticism of the current Secretary General that, he did not, that most should have been done of the crisis that was looming between Russia and the NATO bloc, before it erupted into an actual war. But obviously, I think we can all agree that when tensions start to rise and issues crop up, there needs to be an immediate concerted effort to be put so that the warring parties go into an effective mediation or conciliation process. That's the first thing I want to talk about in terms of peace and security. The second thing is, I've spoken about this vague obligation in Article 33(1) of the UN Charter. It is fairly, in my mind, fairly critical that the UN gives birth to perhaps two things, interrelated things. The first is, and I think members are quite happy, given the current architecture, to take on an obligation to peacefully resolve. Now, I think what we need to do is we need to make this obligation more definite, clearer, and provide an institutional platform that is designed to serve that need. It should not be enough for a state to say, I'm going to call the warring countries, opposing countries' prime minister for coffee, at a nice place, and that's, well, if it fails, it fails, it shouldn't be that woolly. This obligation shouldn't be that woolly. So perhaps a permanent panel of mediators who could be supplanted by, ad hoc additions, depending on the conflict, who is suitable, in an institutionalized format, and there being an obligation on the part of every member when it gets into a crisis with a fellow member, to then take recourse, mandatory recourse, to an institutionalized mediation, right? Now, one other thing that could be added on to that is, to my mind, the ICJ currently can only issue an advisory opinion, not through a request by a member state. It can only do so if an organ of the UN requests it. I think this facility should be expanded such that a concerned party, like Ukraine's neighbor who may get a fallout if a war breaks out, or the contestants could then refer, if the mediation fails, the mandatory mediation institutionalized fails, they can then put certain questions to the ICJ. Now, the ICJ, of course, oversees jus cogent, norm, peremptory norms of international law. And so the ICJ, if given, in such instances, investigative powers, could then issue advisory opinions or recommendations or declaratory judgments. Now, that would be very helpful because, in the current world, I was just talking to Jane and she mentioned the manipulation of the media. States do hide behind political rhetoric, which are then fed through, it's not me saying, but many people say through media, which is, compromised to some extent. And so they hide behind this rhetoric. But, if you have a case where there is recourse, to entrench this principle that right is right, not might. And if the ICJ, having looked at the beginning of a dispute, looks at it and says, we think that, this state's view of the conflict is wrong. You've got it all wrong, right? That, I think, would then create a severely dampening effect on that state to then pursue a rhetoric that it's on the right path, right? Now, I think, a lot of work needs to be done. Some of the things that could be looked at now, there is already a movement where what's being studied is it possible to curtail the veto power of the UN Security Council? That means the UN Security Council veto needs to be circumscribed such that it can only be unleashed if certain conditions are met, right? Whereas right now it's almost a free-for-all. That's the perception at least. The other option is to, in fact, beef up the General Assembly. Why is it that the General Assembly is a tiger toothless made of paper? Maybe we should invest it. I mean, it represents the entire globe, right? Why can't we invest it with a little more, with some real teeth, right? Now, I end with a question, despite, I think, my good friend Abdel trying to throw it to me. A lot of work needs to be done, right? I've just outlined some of the things that appears to spring up from what's already there. And the question that I want to leave you with is, what role should the Chartered Institute play in this context? And that really is a question to be answered by you. Thank you very much.
Well, Francis, I've written so many notes. not all for questions for myself. It's just fascinating. And what you've done is really, and we didn't speak before this, but you've taken the topic that I was so passionate about and to say, you know, we are the thought leaders in dispute resolution here. We've got the skills and the tools. How do we apply them? And the other thing that I've been speaking about a lot is what are the big conversations we need to be having? And this is the big conversation, isn't it? The biggest one we could have. So let me just start with a question and then we'll open it up to others. But I know we've got one question here, which is, what's the role of the International Criminal Court in maintaining international peace and stability? Thank you. That's a good idea. And there's a second part to that, is that, oh yes, what affects their authority and efficiency and how can that be improved? So,
the International Criminal Court, it's made of paper, it's toothless, but it's not even a tiger. The International Commercial Court, you recall, was formed in 20 years ago, 2022, Rome Statute, 123 parties, but none of the key players are parties, right? So the US, China, Russia are not. So the International Commercial Court can't investigate or try sovereign states. It goes after individuals. And I've got to be diplomatic here. Since its inception, it has sought to bring charges against 31 individuals, right? It doesn't try persons in absentia. 14 of them have never been physically with the court. And out of the remaining ones, some died, you know, no fault of the International Criminal Court. They died before it could prosecute them. And there have been only 4 convictions, all centering around atrocities, war crimes in Mali and Congo, right? So the International Commercial Court, unfortunately, unless, you know, there is greater, you know, participation, it's not really a key consideration in this equation, but good question.
So I know we've got a lot of people watching online, so I'd like to take an online question first and then be equitable, fair in how we handle the questions online.
Well, firstly, I can say that there are many superlatives thanking Francis for the lecture, so I think I ought to pass those on. And some really interesting questions. So, first question. There have been some rare examples of mediation achieving results in the international political sphere. The Northern Ireland peace process is an example. However, the success of mediation at this level depends on the involvement of a mediator with high political profile. Bearing that in mind, would a standing panel, as you have suggested, be useful in this context?
Yes, I think so, because, you know, the standing panel will obviously be individuals who are known for their expertise, for their standing, and obviously for their integrity, right? And if you have a standing panel which could be supplanted, you're right, you know, because state-to-state disputes are at multi-levels, right? They arise out of, you know, disputes revolving around access to sea lanes, as in Eritrea, Ethiopia, when Ethiopia became landlocked, when Eritrea became independent, to valuable assets. And they could go back years, you know, if you're looking at cultural, racial, ideological demography. So you're right, you need, you know, it to be mediated at a number of levels. And, you know, you need experts at different levels. But yes, a permanent panel would then ensure that, you know, there is a certain degree of, you know, a certain degree of rigor, a certain degree of expertise, the benefits that come from institutionalization. But it could also have the flexibility of bringing in, you know, key players, you know, for that particular dispute. Because it is quite difficult. It's not an easy task, I can accept. to constitute a panel for an interstate dispute. Imagine empaneling someone or a team for the the Ukraine-Russia dispute. It will be a tough one. But it's not that it can't be done. Thanks.
May I take a question from there's going to be lots of questions. I'd like to ask you to keep your questions short and specific so they're easy to interpret. There was somebody over there, wasn't there, Francis? Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for standing up.
Thank you, Francis, for the enlightening lecture. I think I would like to hear more about the efficiency of the International Criminal Court, and I will try to be brief about that, because, as you've mentioned, we should not underestimate the dispute resolution bodies we have for now. So if we are not too nitpicky about the wording, the provisions of the Rome Statute kind of reaffirm what the UN Charter says about the international peace and security. And yet, 3 out of 5 permanent UN Security Council members are not members of the International Criminal Court. They are also world's leading powers. What do you think we can do about that, especially if we apply this fact to the ongoing military conflicts and the invasion? Thank you.
Well, good question. But I think, sometimes I think I feel like throwing back some of these questions to the audience. Well, I think that's a problem. The problem there is that if you look, the ICC is keen, I believe, to look into what happened in Afghanistan, right? But obviously, its work is hampered by the profile of its membership, right? It has no remit to extend jurisdiction over non-member states, right? So, I think for that reason, it will be very difficult to unless there is a sea change in the perspective of key states in the world, it would be difficult to bring about that change because, it's a voluntary process. They have to adopt the Rome Statute for themselves, right? And so until that happens, I think we can, and given the dynamics that is playing out before us, it will be unlikely that we will see a truly effective functioning international criminal court in the sense that we would hope for, in this room.
It does sound from what you say as though so many things are broken or not functioning or don't have the mechanism to...
Right. There is a consistent thread.
Yeah, there is. Jonathan.
Right, Jonathan Wood. Right, so Francis, I'm going to put you right on the spot here. Do you think the Chartered Institute should set up a geopolitical disputes committee, and would you be prepared to chair it?
Very good question, Jonathan.
No.
Great, that is a hotspot question.
No, I certainly think that the Chartered Institute should consider setting up, committees that will then provide thought leadership to the relevant UN bodies, organs, and other bodies outside the UN. I think the world more than ever before needs concerted action. And I think in order to steer, thought in the right direction, and I think, the Chartered Institute, because of its global reach and, its constituent members, all across the world, is in a unique position to actually, and being experts in what we are talking about, is in a unique position to provide that thought leadership. Now, obviously, John, there was a hook in your question. I'm happy to serve in whatever capacity you want me to. But I did want to say, maybe I'm changing the subject, but I did want to say that Mr. Abdel Wahab did raise his hand. He obviously has some suggestions.
Okay, well, we'll go to Mohammed, and then I'm going to take another question from online. But Mohammed, would you like to?
I just want to Francis, because this is not a topic for the faint-hearted, and you're walking in a landmine. Obviously, what you say is out there. So, and you did it very well and superbly. But I think in order to be able to find a solution, one needs to ask two questions. The first one in relation to the role of the Ciarb. As a UK-based charity, not an international organization, what leverage or powers do we have to be able to sit on the table with the big players? You're not talking anymore about corporations. You're not talking about individuals. And I take the point about membership, but let's remember that the membership, 17,000 plus, these are individuals, each of whom have their work, their premises. And it's not necessarily that all of them, or the majority, have the sufficient influence politically to drag states to sit on a table or to listen. Thought leadership helps, but that requires knowledge and rationality, the two of which normally lack when it comes to political and armed conflicts. And that brings me to the question, if, and only if, there is a table and you're having people to sit on, who will be sitting on this table in the conflict you're talking about? I am not sure it's just Russia and Ukraine. There are players out there who have interests beyond specifically what may happen. So assuming even you have a peace treaty or a settlement broken between both countries in a way, how would that, for example, impact the sanction regimes applied by Europe or the US, and whether this in any way bind them? So I think it is important to have thought leadership, but from your perspective, who would be sitting on the table if you're able to bring them to sit together?
Fabulous question. It sounds like any mediation, really, Mohammed. Who are the stakeholders? Where are they? Who's in the gallery?
I'm very upset that he's asked more questions than he's answered them. Well, Mohammed, you're quite right? Now, I think at one level, there are legal questions of construct, right? How do we solve the rule book issue at the heart of the WTO conundrum? What mechanisms do we need to put in place to strengthen the UN organs in dealing with peace and security breaches across the world? So those certainly, I think, are legal constructs. How do we improve the architecture in place? Going beyond it, yes, it becomes difficult, right? We certainly are in no position to move states to behave in a certain way. I mean, when, bodies which are far more august, the UN General Assembly, right, have not been able to produce the kind of results we would all have hoped for. But I think we certainly can lend, ourselves to the debate on construct in the WTO, in the UN, and I think our voice would be helpful because to a large extent, it is something that we are adept at handling, at breaking down and analyzing. It's not very different, right? It's interstate conflict, but I do believe that this room, is in fact uniquely equipped to take on the task.
Thank you, Francis. Sapna, do we have another question online? No. I don't want to ignore the online audience.
We have many questions online. You pick one. I'd pick one, okay, but I'd like another one later, if I may, please. The WTO dispute settlement understanding envisages members to adopt consensual arbitration as an alternative to the panel and appellate body processes. Do you think Ciarb members might have a greater role and contribution to make in that regard?
Certainly, Sapna, the answer would be yes. And you remember that I also mentioned the MPIA, the interim arbitration, multi-party interim arbitration measure that has been put in place. So 54 states have come together to temporarily resolve the fact that there is no appellate body. And so they've set up an arbitration mechanism which can then replace the appellate body. And certainly, I think that's where the Chartered Institute can definitely get involved in and develop an expertise. So it's also expertise building, because the WTO rules, they live on another planet, right? To what, most private practitioners deal with on a day-to-day basis. But the answer is yes.
And another question, just related, what do you think of that multi-party interim appeal arrangement? Do you have any views on it?
No, it's working. So remember I said in November 2019, there were 24 appeals which were up in the air. A number of them are being resolved, have been resolved through this MPIA. But obviously it is an interim stopgap measure. We really need to fix the system. There needs to be a permanent solution. But obviously, states are frustrated, that their disputes are now in limbo. And in this way, they hope to get, over the curve, at this time. It's not the best, but, it's something that we have to live with for now.
Fabulous. Another question. This lady here, thank you.
Thank you. It's Unishang Simpson here. Francis, thank you for a very, very interesting talk. And you have, I want to move away a bit from the Chartered Institute. You talked about both the General Assembly and the Security Council as being effectively or ineffectively toothless tigers. Now, how do you see, seeing as you're tackling these very, very big questions, how do you see them getting fixed? Because clearly, in your view, they're very broken. Thank you.
Right. So I think the Security Council, so there is movement, as I've said, right, to limit the scope of the veto. Obviously, again, it's going to be very difficult. You need the superpowers to sign on, right? I think ultimately, and even at the General Assembly, it's unlikely. One thing is this, if you look at the Fraser and Dixon study, the one thing that's clear is that sovereign states are not willing. There is a deep hesitance to hand over control over a dispute that, goes deep into the psyche of the state concerned to a third party. So when you come back to the equation of disputes threatening peace and security, I think it's very unlikely you're going to see a mechanism where states would actually do that, right? So I think we need to live with two things. One, we need to adopt the most effective next best measure, which is an obligation, a clear delineated obligation to negotiate, mediate, conciliate. And if that fails, we need to create a structure where a body with integrity, which is trusted, which has the ability to garner the facts surrounding the dispute, to then rule effectively as an international court to say, this dispute, quite clearly, this is right and this is wrong. And the sense is that to a large extent would then set the scene, right? Because then, you can't then pretend that you're in the right, and play games of propaganda. You might still do that, but it'll become harder. But I think that's what we'll have to settle for. And beyond that, I think, we hope parties are rational. And I think, we would not be here today if the leaders of these key states, the superpower states, were irrational. We wouldn't be here, right? We've come to the brink before. This is not the first time. We are now approaching the brink. But, rationality does prevail. We certainly hope.
And actually, the gentleman there had a question. Thank you.
Hello, Julian Wilkins. Thank you very much, Francis. This is a fascinating topic and one that very timely and needed. I think somebody mentioned earlier about the Northern Ireland assessment. We mustn't forget that while we had the politicians and very much somebody like Senator George Mitchell leading the way, there was a lot happening on the ground in the communities. There were mediators going out, reflecting back what the politicians were talking about and building consensus in the communities. And even after the Good Friday Agreement, there was a mediation system set up to deal with sort of, the people who had been affected by the Troubles. In fact, I applied and almost got one of the mediation roles in that. And I think when you think about what we could do, the Institute, is to think about not only trying to get to the politicians, but what we can do at a more grassroots level in the communities, and through that build trust with the politicians. And maybe it's not so much a question, but more observations. Our title, I think the word independence is important. Maybe need an extra I in the title. Thank you.
Thank you for that, because that's very important. So the whole idea, the minute you can funnel a political problem or a military problem into mandatory institutionalized process, a conciliation, mediation, peace process, then you're converting the conversation. Firstly, you're opening up a dialogue, right, where, it may exist or it may not exist. You're opening up a dialogue. You are converting it into, you're looking at it and analyzing it in the framework of, as you say, in a different form, right? You're looking at the needs of the stakeholders. At a different level, you're looking at the state of the rules, whether there is adherence. So you're transforming, rhetoric, pure political or military, strategy, like moving chess pieces, into a conversation that is legal, based on interests of stakeholders. And I think that going through that process, I think, helps. And it's been shown to help in the example that you've given, and in the many examples where, a process has been initiated. Going back to the study, 1/4 of militarized disputes go through this process. That is truly alarming, right? And that is what we need to fix.
So, Francis, we, the citizens, the stakeholders, so I appreciate that point, because it's thinking about all the different levels that we could have leadership at, or affect, or initiate conversation at. And one of those levels could be the societal level, because many people just feel powerless, don't they? But, even opening up the ability to have a conversation about what does this actually mean, and to understand some of what you've conveyed to us would be really helpful for many people, I think. Not everybody wants to get involved, but some people do want to understand and to know what they could do and what dialogue they could have at a deeper level. Very helpful. There's a question right at the back there, and then I'll take a couple more from online.
Nathan Landis from the Australia branch. Picking up on a comment that Mohammed made earlier, do you think it's a logical evolution for Ciarb to seek, for example, observer status at the United Nations, to give itself a platform to be a participant in these sorts of discussions, whether that's the next logical evolution to resolution? And if so, would you be prepared to be a part?
question, and maybe John would, if I may. But good point, Nathan. And I think maybe those are the kind of questions we need to be asking ourselves, right? And why not? But I don't know the answer to that, whether we will succeed, obviously. But yes.
We are actually observers at the United Nations UNCITRAL working groups 2 and 3, just so everyone knows. We are quite active in that space, in fact.
Okay. Hello. I find your presentation very interesting because that is my area of studies in international commercial law. So I followed everything step by step, and I mean, you're right on point. And I agree with all of the previous speakers, all of the questions they've asked. And I note that you have mentioned about not only this institution, but the UN, WTO, those are important institutions that really need to come together to help resolve the situation. Now, in addition to that, I think that in order to have a stronger push, there must be some form of political interference in order to have this moving. Do you think so? That's one of my questions. And my second question is, what is the time frame would you put on this matter? Do you think that this should be completed within maybe a year, 2 years, 5 years from now? Do you visualize this being resolved with the necessary push from the various institutions?
Well, thank you. Now, my first choice is Jonathan Wood, but now, so just don't forget, right? We talked about expertise in this room. You've just heard, right? So we have expertise in this room for sure, right? And some of us have been studying it for many years, right? And you're one of them. On the issue of political weight, obviously that is correct, right? Now, this sea shift that came about in June, right, where the US, along with all the member states, have set themselves a time limit of 2024, right, to resolve the impasse in the dispute mechanism of the WTO, didn't come about overnight. And obviously there was a huge political push because if I recall correctly, 57 times, 57 resolutions were led by Mexico on behalf of, I believe, 128 states to fix this problem. 57 times it was rejected, but in June something cracked, right? So obviously there needs to be a political will, and things happen because a large number of states keep pressing for reform, right? So political mileage is at the heart of it, right? And I think the majority of nations do appreciate the problem that we face as a globe. And there are enough members of the UN General Assembly as constituent members of the UN, who obviously take the approach they know what to focus on in order to resolve it. So I think in terms of, so obviously the answer to the question is yes, you do need political will, but political will needs to coalesce around something, right? What do we do, right? And so we need to fix the rule book. The WTO rule book needs to be fixed. And there obviously, members of states, representatives in the UN, they need help because that is not a political question. It's a legal question of ideal construct, right? And the politicians are not, that's not their turf. It's our turf. Now, in terms of a timetable,
you did say
It was 5 minutes to midnight, though.
Well, you know, on the trade front, the players themselves have set a timetable. Now, in terms of peace and security, I don't see reforms biting in even in 2 to 3 years, right? It'll take time. But I think opening up the dialogue, opening up a dialogue between states as to how, what we do, even if you get to a point where even the involved states recognize that something needs to be done and pull them into the conversation, I think that then changes the aspect of the problem, because people are then talking. You know, you've got delegates. Look at what happened in June. You have state representatives sitting around a table and talking about the need to reform. That in itself is very healthy, you know. I mean, if you come back to 5 minutes before midnight, you know, we all take different views. Some of us are pessimists, some of us are optimists. Maybe we all need to be realists. You know, I mean, I do believe rationality will prevail, right? But obviously that's a matter for debate. You know, many of these questions I feel, you know, somewhat inadequate to answer. But
Isabel, because you've got some experience also in this field, yes. And then we'll take a couple from online.
I'll try and be brief. In the mid-60s, there was a huge movement, interdisciplinary movement of mathematicians, linguists, social and political science, and law. Pound Conference happened in the 70s. ADR appeared, late 70s, and the results of that have been a split that's been reasonably clearly empirically demonstrated between law and everybody else. And everybody else is doing mediation training and training on dispute resolution of different levels of adjudicative levels, from the very facilitative to the highly adjudicative. And in this context, I repeatedly hear people talking about things that are happening that we think we should be doing, and I absolutely agree. And in the other world that I've spent time in, I listen to people doing the same thing, but in that world, there's almost no lawyers. And in this world, there's very few people from all these other interdisciplinary fields. And what I would love to see us do is to actually re-engage with the conversation that was started in the 60s with the other sides of the question of how do we deal with underlying conflict, long-term things which are happening on a societal level and then all the way up. And to have that legal expertise in the context of those social, political science, language and so on discussions, and to have more of those people in this sort of discussion as well, because there's lots of work going on at these levels of dialogue at the local level with people from the countries that are in conflict, in the regions in conflict, and we don't necessarily know about them in this world, and they don't necessarily get reported in those types of studies either. So it's just a plaidoyer to look outside this legal context, which has a big thing to offer, but we need to open our ears as well.
Comment on that?
You want to say that? Why don't you comment? It's a very good point.
Well, no, I think, you know, what you're talking about, Isabel, is the fact that we need to have dialogue between groups as well as dialogue, you know, up. You know, there are a lot of groups working scattered maybe at this level, and they need to have dialogue as well as to try and influence those who are further up the chain. So that makes sense. And if there is to be an initiative which comes out of this, perhaps that's one of the things that needs to happen.
You're quite right. I mean, a contract problem is perhaps 1 or 2 dimensional, but a conflict in South Sudan, it's maybe 7 dimensional. And legal framework analysis would perhaps be 1 or 2 of those dimensions. You're quite right, Isabel. It's a lot more complicated.
Yes, right. I've got to take a couple from online. Jonathan?
Oh, Mike.
Mike.
Sorry.
Sorry to be twice, but just as a matter of interest, I was... yeah, I'm sure you do. You're going to put me on the spot. But just as a matter of interest, I had dinner, in fact, with a former MP who's now in the House of Lords, who was involved in the Northern Ireland discussions or mediation. And he then, after the Good Friday Agreement, went and did a mediation course and said to me, my God, I wish I'd done that first. So I do think there is a role for us to, and I mean this goes to Isabel's point, that we do have a role to talk to the politicians at a higher level to show what we do have to offer in training in this regard. So,
they do not have skills in dispute resolution.
Yes, well, exactly. So I think that, we talk about these grand ideas, but what we do is training, and there is a need in that area.
Excellent. I'd just like to take a couple of questions, because we've got an invisible audience, but we mustn't forget them.
And then back to...
Yes.
There's comments online, phrased as questions, but I think they're questions to which it's clear we don't have any answers yet, but we've got a lot of food for thought. Exactly touching on what Jonathan mentioned, which is, can we penetrate these international dispute resolution bodies to offer training, mediation services, etc. Maybe training is one of the vehicles through which we can get more involved in enabling peace. But just one question, considering that the basis of international dispute resolution is consensus, isn't the more interesting question for us to ponder how we can ensure that the French or the US instance doesn't happen where consent is withdrawn? Ultimately, if you look at a commercial context, when someone withdraws from the process, it's going to be very different on the international context, and really shouldn't we be figuring out how to solve that problem? Not that it's a zero-sum game and we shouldn't be having this discussion, but do you not think that's potentially a more interesting, or at least a very important question?
Yes, I mean, that would be the gold standard. But is it a realistic standard in the near term, mid-term? I think all of you know the answer, or have a sense of the answer. It is going to be very difficult, right? And so I think we can take it, phased. I think a compulsory regime for international peace and security, we are far away from that. Yeah, I think that gentleman, he's... Yeah. Right.
Thank you very much for a lovely panel. So the investment policy database says there is about 2,500 bilateral investment treaties. Out of those, about just over 650 have mediation or conciliation clause in them. So that's almost 25%. So with non-binding dispute settlement provisions with mediation available, so my question is to the whole room, how many of you have actually been practicing mediation in investor-state disputes, and how prevalent is it, how successful it is? I know I can't even pronounce that Sisyphean struggle. So how have you found it in terms of mediating investor disputes? Have you been involved in any of those bits and ISDS issues?
Right. So my friend, do forgive me, but I've actually, I focused on interstate disputes, so not ISDS, right? But on your question, Amarjit, just one second. On your question on the ISDS, yes, there's a big movement for mediation, and it is gaining traction. And states like it because of certainly, we've seen Asian states like it because it's non-transparent process. It is very consensual driven. But obviously there are difficulties, right? For a state to settle a matter, and usually these investor-state disputes are politicized many a times. And it is difficult a state, especially, the new regime, which obviously may have won the election on the basis that those deals that were cut by the previous regime were bad ones. And then to be elected as a new regime and to resolve them amicably doesn't put them in a good political light. So, you know, there are obviously all these difficulties, but you're quite right, my friend, we are seeing a big move in mediation for obvious reasons. People do not want to have to be exposed to, you know, this vagaries of a huge award being made against them. Right, but Jane, you're in control. Amajid had...
Mohammed had one word to say, and then we'll come back over here.
I was tempted to ask this initially, but now I have to. Taking your invitation to be realists, let me ask you this, and it's a very simple question. Do you consider that in today's world, the rule of law is subservient to political interests or vice versa? And if it's vice versa, to what extent are veto rights aligned with the rule of law? Because much of the discussion we have is about manifestations of the rule of law. If that is not the prevalent principle globally, I feel we have an issue. But what do you consider that is the answer?
I think we might be here till midnight. Never mind 5 minutes to midnight.
well, you know, Mohammed has put a very keen finger on the pulse of the problem, right? So you have a sense that a state's, you know, conduct is dictated by national interests, right? And that overrides framework of, you know, the existing international framework that could be in place. But I think we've found ourselves now in a position where there is not even frameworks to talk about, right? The frameworks have disintegrated. Yes, I mean, Mohammed, you're quite right. Even if we succeed in putting in place frameworks, there is no certitude that then there will be proper behavior. You could get to a point where you have compulsory access to the ICJ. There are then apparently binding declarations of the ICJ upon states who are subject to the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ. And then the states who are at the wrong end of the ICJ ruling say, so what? But I think the problem that we find ourselves in are far from that. We don't even have a framework. We're trying to erect a framework in the hope that you know, you have a system of rule of law in place where, you know, it becomes difficult for a state to unleash rhetoric when it is quite clear that it is a bad player.
I'm very conscious of the time. I'm going to take two more questions, one from over here and one from online, and then we will, I'm sure, continue our discussion over drinks, but I know that
we did think we would end by 7.
We thought we'd end by 7, I know, but the deadline was 7:30 and we're at 7:34, so I'm going to take two more questions.
And then observation. I mean, it's a takeaway for me from hearing everyone here and the role that Ciarb can play. Everything is broken, as you said. And at the level that you spoke about, Francis, also within the conflict, it's always fluid. Actors get to a point where they need resolution. And I think that's what Francis is talking about. We need to think of the rules that will come into play at the time, at an opportune moment, when there's a chance to resolve something. Voltaire said, nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. So I think we are now thinking about that idea to deploy it when the time has come. Thank you.
You're quite right. And I just want to say, certainly in the trade front, right, you know, it's obviously a different creature than the peace and security front. But thank you.
No, I'm going to take one more question from online, and then I think we are going to have to finish and take, or we might take Karen's question. Do you want to take Karen's question quickly?
I'm here. Karen Akinci, I'm from Istanbul and Wales. So just an observation really and your thoughts on it. So we work a lot in investor-state disputes, and before saying that, when two parties are in dispute, or people or companies, there's always this overarching legal system within which they're disputing, and they can come away from that and go into arbitration, and that's great. But when you're in investor-state dispute environment, you're effectively suing in arbitration, shall we say, a state. But there is no overarching legal system within which the state is bound, because the state is sovereign, and the only thing that you can do with them is to, get them to agree on something that they've already agreed before, which is the BIT. Now, even within investor-state arbitration, I have very interesting war stories that I could share with you. If you ever tried to, you've won the case against a certain thing, but you're trying to get the Taliban to pay up. Yeah, that's not going to happen. That's very, very difficult. How do you enforce that? You don't. All you do is you sit down in diplomatic environment and you try to broker some sort of a settlement with them. And the way that I see it, the only way that you can ever get states and states to cooperate is through diplomatic mediation. There is no other way, because there is no overriding mechanism within which they have to behave themselves. Yes, the rule of law, but when all's said and done, a state is sovereign and it's going to do what it needs to do. I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
No, you're spot on, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. So
Thank you for sharing that.
A question from online, then we're going to wrap up, and then we're going to go and continue the discussion over drinks and...
I think Karen actually answered the question I was going to ask from our online attendees, sort of, which is, what measures would the speaker suggest to obtain political buy-in from countries that are seen as needing what you're proposing?
So I guess there are two things, right? One is something that Amarjit touched on. In the trade sphere, certainly, states, do need a solution, right? Trade is the lifeblood of states, and you have problems, and states do need to fix it, right? So it's an imperative that the system be fixed. On the peace and security front, it's back to Mohammed Karen's issue, right? You're talking about a sovereign state. How do you get it to bend its will, if it doesn't wish to? And there's no easy answer to that, right? So, and so we've been focusing on, having a mandatory, clear, defined path that a state would be obliged to take. And once that journey is taken, we are hoping that, with the lines of communication, the transformation of the paradigm from a military conflict to a legal or an interest-driven perspective would then transmute that problem. But, we've reason to be optimistic. It's 2022. We still walk on the face of the earth.
Well, look, that's a perfect place to wrap up. Francis, wrap up. I've seen the room enwrapped. They've been completely absorbed by this discussion, and I'm sure it will continue, and I hope it does continue, because I think it's a really important one. And I think Karen's point about, we can only do this through dialogue. It does reflect the mediation process. And wherever that happens, even if it's behind the radar, it's a start, isn't it? So there are different areas where each of us can go out and do this. Francis, I'd like to thank you enormously. I know you've spent so long preparing this, but from my perspective, it was well worth it. Really very well done, and thank you. Thank you to everybody in the room for your questions, which have sort of added to the conversation. Thank you to the online audience. I know we've got many, many people who've joined us online. I know this is going to be recorded, so there'll be an opportunity to watch it later. And I'd just like to wrap up by saying, I think really we are in this time of crisis. We are the thought leaders. We have the opportunity to be at whatever level. It might be even within your family that you talk about these things. It might be within your community, but things ripple out, don't they? So not having the conversations. I'm always asking my clients, what conversations are you not having? Is this a conversation we're not having that we could be having at different levels? And it is about putting your hand up, I think. I always say, and one of the things that's come up today, put your hand up, not out, volunteer, do something, speak up, speak out. So those are all the things that we can do if we want to and if we choose to. And again, you know, the answers are in the room. They always are. So thank you again, Francis. Thank you again, everybody. Let's keep talking.